It is now more than 2 weeks since clashes broke out in East Jerusalem over the Jewish settlement of Arab homes. Hamas fired its first rockets towards Israel from Gaza a week later, and the Israeli Defense Force quickly responded. And the violence now seems to be intensifying, with rocket attacks coming from South Lebanon late last night. It's the worst violence in the region since the war of 2014. But the Middle East has changed since 2014, dramatically. Fear of Iran led to last year's Abraham Accords, and the emerging alliance between Israel and several Arab states has drastically changed the geopolitical landscape. I'm Christian Smith, and on this special episode of Talking Geopolitics, I'm joined by Geopolitical Futures Chairman and Founder George Friedman in Austin, and our Middle East expert Hilal Kashan in Beirut, to explore the geopolitics behind the violence, the why now, and what the wider context is for the region. George, let me start with you. The Israel-Palestine conflict is one that really only takes a small spark to light it again. I mean, the last war was only in 2014. What was the spark here?
Well, there was the spark over the question of housing in Jerusalem and the expulsion of Palestinians from that housing. There was violence by both sides, but really this is merely the immediate cause. There is an ongoing struggle, it's unequal, between the Palestinians and the Jews. The Palestinians are caught in Gaza through endless miscalculation on their part. They have been backed into Gaza. Gaza represents a threat to Israel because Iranians, for example, have armed Gazans with missiles. Israel is a threat to Palestinians because they want to stop this. And so we get endless iterations of the same conflict. And that conflict in Gaza now is the Israelis attack, Gazans attack, and they argue over who attacked first. Really immaterial. We have to see this as an issue that existed since before the founding of Israel, between various struggles between the native Palestinians and the Israelis, and before Israel was born, and it goes on and on and on. The Palestinians will not give ground, the Israelis will not give ground, and therefore there will be violence like this.
I would say that whether there was an issue in East Jerusalem over driving Palestinians out of their residence or not, clashes were bound to happen. Clashes between Israel and Hamas started right after Hamas seized Gaza from Fatah movement in 2007. And the first big outburst of violence happened in 2008, December 2008. And then it was followed by another huge outburst of violence in 2014. Now, the 2014 outburst of violence tested the outcome of the Arab uprisings. By then, the Arab uprisings were defeated. Now, I think this spate of violence seems to be testing the outcome of the Abraham Accords between Bahrain, the UAE, and Israel. After every major milestone between Arabs and Israelis, violence occurs. For example, right after Israel and Egypt signed the Camp David Accords, Israel invaded Lebanon, and then Israel also annexed the Golan Heights. So this spate of fighting, accounts to the evolution, the radical transformation of the Middle East. Hamas didn't really have to fire missiles. They knew what would happen if they provoked the Israelis by firing missiles at Jerusalem. They crossed a red line, a very thick red line, and I think they fell in the trap. But again, one would say that they felt that their backs were to the wall, isolated in the Arab world, and unable to get to get moving. The situation in Gaza is gruesome, and Palestinians there feel that they don't really have anything to lose.
I mean, what you're saying essentially is that Hamas knew very well that what they were doing would result in more violence, but they felt like they had no other choice. I mean, if we just stick with the short term here, then, George, is that essentially a situation where Hamas is just, its back's to the wall, as Hillel said? It needs an outcome of some kind at the moment. Is that what it wants? It's just some kind of change of the situation?
Well, obviously, it's not the situation they want. It's increasingly untenable situation. What they've seen, and this has to be understood, is the effective abandonment of the Arab world to the Palestinian cause. That was going on for a long time. But the Abraham Covenant really nailed it shut. And you had no massive rising. In fact, several of these countries made anti-Hamas statements. So their position at this point is capitulation, or create a situation in which the Arab world at least must intervene. I think what they would like is to create a sufficient disaster for themselves to get the Arab world in a position that they cannot continue the covenant, that they have to break out of it. That seems like a very strange thing to say, but when your choice is between absolute capitulation and military disaster, you've got some very bad choices. But I think the covenant was one of the triggers here, because they knew the Israelis were going to hit them back for the missiles they fired. And they also knew that the Arab world would not come to their aid. They're trying desperately to change the dynamic.
Okay, so because of that, I mean, do we think that all of the calls at the moment for a ceasefire and hopefully this is going to be over in the short term, is that really just going to fall on deaf ears?
I don't think it'll fall on deaf ears. Something has happened, which is the Arab world did not respond in any way indicating meaningful involvement. There has been no attempt by them to really force any change in the situation. And as this sinks in on Hamas, and already has, well, they've offered a ceasefire. The Israelis have not accepted it because the Israelis want this to be the last war. They're prepared to be very brutal in putting down Hamas. And so they've offered a ceasefire. Israel has rejected it. They want more radical conciliation. And at the same time, the world stands by unmoved.
To what extent is Israel ready to go to achieve that end? I mean, they've, as much as they obviously have the military superiority in the area, they're also very casualty adverse, and going into Gaza with ground forces would inevitably mean pretty devastating fighting for both sides. Are they willing to do that at the moment?
I think they're absolutely not willing to go into Gaza. Urban fighting is the bloodiest fighting of all, but they don't feel the need to. Iron Dome, which is their air defense, their missile defense system, has worked superbly. The Hamas has not been able to really strike significantly at Israel. They have excellent missile capabilities that are going on. The Israelis are not going to need to go into Gaza to devastate the Hamas. And the question is, how far are they prepared to go? And what they're finding is that the world that's significant to them really doesn't care. And that, plus Netanyahu's statement that he will go as far as he has to go, is what is something that Hamas is thinking about very deeply. They have to be. They realize they walked into a trap, and they can only extricate them by making some very significant conciliations with the Israelis.
I don't think Israel is interested in destroying Hamas. Israel is interested in weakening Hamas to the point where Netanyahu could claim a victory. I mean, defeating Hamas would leave a vacuum in Gaza, and then Israel would be required to shoulder responsibility for it. Israel was happy to quit Hamas, to quit Gaza and leave it behind. So I don't think a military operation or an invasion is their objective. The Israelis may decide eventually to launch a surgical ground offensive, but not a massive ground offensive, because just like you said, there is no need for it. Most of Israel's objectives have already been achieved in Gaza.
What's the feeling in the Arab world? We are in Lebanon, Hillel.
Arab official reaction is timid, and depending on what channel you view, you will see that, for example, in Bahrain and the Emirates and the Saudis, they simply don't take a stand. They equate between Hamas and Israel. And actually, when they talk about the Palestinian side, they never mention Hamas by name. There is no acknowledgement of Hamas. In Lebanon, it is different, because everything goes in Lebanon. And, rockets were fired last night, but they missed Israel and landed inside Lebanese territory. They were not the work of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is keen on avoiding provoking Israel. That's why the Israelis responded rather mildly. They fired 20 rounds of artillery on southern Lebanese territory. So I don't expect the situation, the border situation between Israel and Lebanon, to go out of control. But there are demonstrations in a number of Arab cities, in Tunis city, in Beirut, in Amman, in Baghdad also. But these are routine, and Palestinians don't take them seriously. They happen every time there is a major operation between Hamas and Israel. But what I noticed this time is that the scale of Arab protests, the scale of Arab public protests against the Israeli offensive is much smaller in size than it was in previous encounters.
So, this idea that George mentioned of Hamas potentially wanting to try and push other Arab countries to the point where they have to revert to what they have in previous decades and being very critical of Israel in these situations, and potentially making them break from the current emerging alliance structure in the Middle East following the Abraham Accords. Are you seeing that that's pretty unlikely?
No, I don't see it. I don't see it because, Hamas understands that nothing they would do would move the Arabs and coerce them to revise or reverse their policies. I think Hamas' objective is much narrower than that. They want to get the Palestinians in the West Bank and inside Israel moving. And if that was their objective, they seem to have been successful. The third Intifada is already underway, or there are the beginnings of a third Intifada in the West Bank. Today there was an armed clash between the Israelis and Palestinians on a border crossing. And today is also a major strike in Arab areas in Israel and in the West Bank. So if Hamas's objective was to get the Palestinian people moving and unite the feelings of Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel, then they seem to be succeeding so far.
Well, here I disagree a little with Hillel, which is that the kinds of intifadas we had before shook Israel to the core. This is not doing it for a number of reasons. One, it's relatively small. Secondly, the Intifada could take place and the attacks on Hamas intensifying. It does not solve their problem. So what they, I think, really wanted to see was that the Arab world would observe what they would call the barbarism of the Israelis and break with Israel. Israel would now find itself in a much weaker relationship with, for example, the United States, which now, ever since the Abraham Covenant, it has been sort of moderate. But that hasn't happened. What has happened is not a systemic uprising, but a kind of fragmented uprising. Now, this may gel into something, but by the time it does, it's not clear, how much of Hamas is going to be left. One of the things to note has been Israel targeting senior Hamas officials and military officers. And Israel seems to have excellent intelligence on what's there and what they want to hit, and they're hitting it. So the time when an intifada would have mattered would have been the second, third day. At this point, it's maybe more outrageous and maybe bringing them to the streets, but the damage to Hamas has been done. Gaza has been wrecked.
And sorry, George, just for our listeners who aren't too sure what an intifada is, could you just explain what an intifada is?
Well, intifada was a widespread uprising in Israel against the Israeli government, an attempt to assert a range of Israeli rights. It was sometimes violent. It was completely intrusive. It created a tremendous stress inside of Israel. And it had some political impact. Hilla, would you agree with that?
Yes, the uprising, the first Intifada or uprising, or popular revolt happened in December 1987 when an Israeli truck ran over 3 Palestinians in a refugee camp in Gaza and killed them. But, the Palestinians were already suffering from frustration at that time, and they felt that the older generation had failed in reinstating them to their homes. So they started the Intifada, and that Intifada started and lasted until the outburst of Desert Storm for liberating Kuwait from Iraqi occupation. But again, the first Intifada was characterized by stone throwing. The second Intifada in 2000 became militarized, and that accelerated its defeat. As soon as it became militarized, the Israelis succeeded in defeating it. Then it changed into suicide bombings.
Talking Geopolitics is brought to you by Geopolitical Futures, your source for geopolitical forecasting and analysis.
So I think the question, if we go back to this idea that the Arab countries are not responding in the ways they have typically have in the past, and they're not particularly willing to even look like they're going to break away from this new alliance structure in the Middle East. The obvious question to that is why, and obviously that has a lot to do with Iran. So, George, what's the position here? I mean, is it a situation of who they are more fearful of, or what consequence they are more fearful of, and the fact is that they, Arab states at the moment realize that they need to stick with the current arrangement because the option of giving Iran more strength is just not worth thinking about.
Well, I think, beginning, and Hill can say more about this, there's an illusion that the Arab world supported the Palestinians when they went to war with Israel. So, for example, in 1948, they went to war. There was another war in 56, 67 with Egypt. Then in 73, a major one, Egypt and Syria. So when you look at this, okay, what happened was they were opposed to Israel. They feared a powerful European support to Israel because of themselves. But as we saw after 1967, they were not eager to create a Palestinian state. They talked about it. And as for the countries that were not what we call confrontation states, the ones not bordering on Israel, they paid lip service, but took no risks on behalf of the Palestinians. So you have to take a difference between, say, for example, Egypt's national security interests and interests in the Palestinians. The Palestinians are a much abandoned people. They're abandoned by the Jews, obviously. They were abandoned by the British. They were abandoned by the Arab world. So their tragedy is that, abandoned by all of these, they face now an overwhelming power, Israel, that is no longer leashed by the United States or by international relations. When the Soviets were powerful, the United States wanted to limit what the Israelis did in order to not to generate feeling, anti-Israeli and anti-American feeling. At this point, the United States is happily rearming them as the war goes on. So when we look at the situation, it is not that we've gone from a real commitment to the Palestinians in the Arab world to this. It is that the indifference to the Palestinians in the Arab world and the rest of the world has simply become more dramatic. I don't know if Hillel agrees with me on this.
Yeah, in 1948, the Hashemites entered Palestine in order to get their part of Palestine, the West Bank. And the Egyptians entered it because King Farouk, who wanted to become the caliph of the Muslims, had delusions about scoring an easy victory and then declaring himself the caliph. This was an issue in Egypt since 1924 when Ataturk abrogated the caliphate. Now, the question of Palestine is that it was never important for Arabs. This is the truth. Jerusalem was not important for Muslims. For Muslims, this is Mecca and Medina. It was the Palestinians after 1948 who realized that they were not in a position to go back home on their own, planted the idea that Jerusalem was an important Muslim city. In reality, it is not. And they succeeded to an extent in marketing this idea. But for centuries, Jerusalem lay, slumbered in Arab consciousness. It didn't matter comparing to the two holy shrines in Mecca and Medina. So, after the October War of 1973, the Arabs got tired of the Palestinian questions. And that's why when the Arab Summit in Algiers took place in November 1973, the Arabs decided that the PLO was the sole representative of the Palestinian people. That scaled down the Arab-Israeli conflict and transformed it into an Israel-Palestine conflict. But the Israelis were smart enough to split the Palestinians. Israel encouraged the rise of Hamas, which made its debut in 1987. And then the Israelis regretted it. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin told Arafat, he said, I regret allowing Hamas to emerge, but it was too late. Now, but again, the ability of Hamas to rise had to do with Israeli Prime Minister Sharon, who described Yasser Arafat as irrelevant to peace. And then, as you know, the Palestinians held the general elections in 2006, and Hamas won decisively in the West Bank. At that point, Israel and the U.S. sanctioned Hamas, leading to fighting between Hamas and Fatah in Gaza when Hamas was able to seize it from the PLO and evict them. And since then, Gaza came under a tight Israeli blockade, and fighting has gone every now and then, rising to major confrontations every now and then. So this is the situation. Israel succeeded in preventing the Palestinians from creating a viable political force that could negotiate with them. And to tell you the truth, I don't think Israel is unhappy about the presence of Hamas in Gaza, but they want to keep him weak.
I think the important thing to bear in mind is that there's two narratives here. One is a story of the Palestinians. The other is the story of the Arab world. And people conflate that who are outside the Arab world. But within it, they also understand that the fates of each are different. So, yeah, Iran is something they worry about a great deal. Israel is anti-Iranian. The UAE is anti-Iranian. The Saudis are very worried about the Iranians. That's one thing. But it's not a new story that the other Arab countries were pursuing their interests independently, and the Palestinians were not necessarily very high on their list. This is the thing to always remember. And had the Arab world actually organized themselves to take arms against Israel, say in the early 1950s, it might have been a very different story. But the Jordanians were very happy to see the Israelis there, protect them from the Saudis. The Syrians were interested in very different things, so no one was going to do that. And the tragedy of the Palestinians is they could not adjust to this reality. They wanted to have an independent state, even though they were facing a power that was much greater than them and had no real allies.
So I think that's really interesting from both of you as well, because it is obviously very easy to see situations like this as part of the wider story of what's going on elsewhere, rather than, as you say. I mean, is it therefore wrong to think that this is just another aspect of, because of course Iran is in some ways, well, in many ways, supplying Hamas with rockets and that sort of thing. Is it wrong, therefore, to see this in any way as an Iranian proxy war?
I don't think the Middle East sees Hamas as an effective Iranian tool. It is too static. It is too contained. Hezbollah is a different matter. Various forces in Syria are a different matter. But one way or the other, this is not where the anti-Iranian conflict will come out. And, as I said before, look, the tragedy of the Palestinians is that everybody has more important things to do than worry about them. But we'll very happily encourage them to take steps that will lead to catastrophe. And this has been the history for a very long time. So if this was their attempt to mobilize the Arab world, it's not just Iran that they're concerned with. They're concerned with internal issues. And like all of our lives, we may sympathize a great deal with our brethren, but we have to go to work in the morning.
I think in many ways what's happened over the past 70 years with Palestine is that, as you've said, is that it's been used by other powers for their own political gains. And in some ways, in many ways, that's still happening. And I think what I want to talk about here is the role of Turkey. Turkish President Erdogan has come out in the last day or two suggesting that Turkey should mediate for the potential peace between Israel and Palestine at the moment. It's interesting that that's happened, because I think in many ways one of the main geopolitical struggles that Israel is going to face in the future is not just from Iran, but potentially from an ever-expanding or an ever-aggressive Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean. Does Turkey have a role to play here? Are they relevant, or is this Erdogan just seeing an opportunity and trying to grab it?
Well, my view is that Erdogan has very little credibility with the Israelis, because it is always postured against Israel, although not threatened it directly. I'm not sure what Hamas's view of Turkey is. I think they'll take help from anyone else. But again, if you're going to negotiate between Israel and Hamas, you have to have a relationship with both. And there are very few countries that can claim that both would trust. So it's hard to be a neutral arbitrator in this situation.
Yeah, exactly. But there's another thing. I don't think Hamas wants to end the conflict. Hamas is an ideological movement. I don't think they have abandoned their dream of creating a Palestinian state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. They are interested in a long-term, ideologically incapable of negotiating peace. And that is the split between them and the PLO.
Well, that brings very nicely onto what I'd like to finish with, which is the longer term view of the situation here. I think unfortunately we've painted a rather depressing picture from Palestine's point of view. But what is the long term situation here? I mean, that's been the question for 70 years in many ways. Do we see anything changing in the next 10, 20, 30 years, or is what we're seeing at the moment, is the status quo going to remain so? Hillel, can I ask you first?
Hamas doesn't want to end the conflict. And I don't think Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is either interested in ending the conflict. He's interested in pacification. He's interested every now and then they allow more food, more money to go to Gaza. Every now and then he allows fishermen to fish in the Mediterranean. or 10 kilometers. But that's not everyone. And then there is pacification, there is a truce. But I don't think the two sides are interested in finding a way out of the conflict.
Israel has won. Israel is secure. The Palestinians have lost. They've lost partly because they were inflexible when they had to be flexible. And they've lost mostly because they're too small and have no outside support. The region is returning to what it has always been, very much like Europe, constantly shifting coalitions, partnerships, interests. So now we have the Abraham Accords and others will emerge. But what has happened is that Israel has become a Middle Eastern country. It is part of the Middle Eastern system. It guarantees the security of some countries, threatens the security of others. And it is no longer an intruder from Europe. After 70 years, it has become an essential part of the Middle East. And the Middle East depends on its role as they depend on the role of Saudi Arabia, for example, or others. Now, the question is, how will Israel play this hand? It is in the strongest position it's been since its founding, before its founding. It has decisions to make on what risks it will take, what alliances it will make, how it will continue these things. It wants to deal with Iran, and so do the other Arabs. So it's a very interesting, complex situation. But if you want to understand the Middle East today, think of Europe in 1938. Constantly changing interests, alliances, and so on. This is the normal nation state now. The situation of Israel has been normalized. And as to the Palestinian issue, it is a tragedy that no one is prepared to give their lives or their wealth for. And that's the reality. They are, however, prepared to make speeches about it. And that's not what the Palestinians need. But that's what they get and what they've gotten for a very long time.
George Friedman in Austin and Hilal Kashan in Beirut, thank you both very much for coming on this special edition of Talking Geopolitics. And you can find a link to George's most recent article on the situation in Gaza in the description for this podcast. We will be back with our normal podcast schedule, which will continue, and that'll be next week on Wednesday, so about 8 days from when this one is published. But until then, you take care, and we'll see you soon.
You've been listening to Talking Geopolitics from the team at Geopolitical Futures. If you like what you've heard, be sure to subscribe to Talking Geopolitics wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to hear your comments and questions. Go to geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast to leave your feedback. That's geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast.